Okay, welcome everyone to the Portsmouth Athenaeum and the start of our 2026 program season. Our Current Affairs Committee always gets up early in the morning. So raise your hands, Current Affairs Committee. So once they're up early in the morning, they want to start planning programs and getting them going. So here we are in January with our first program of the year. Yes, and I am going to be introducing our moderator, Mr. Gil Barndollar, or I should say Dr. Gil Barndollar, who is both an Athenaeum Proprietor and a member of the Current Affairs Committee. Yes, and he is a graduate of Bowdoin and Cambridge, and he is the Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Strategic Studies at Catholic University. He's had a number of other strategic academic posts. He's written for the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, every other academic outlet you could think of, and he's appeared as an expert on CNN and various other TV outlets, including BBC World. Yes. And he is not just an academic. He knows this from real life experience. He spent 7 years as an officer in the U.S. Marine Corps with 2 deployments in Afghanistan. So I'm turning things over to Gilman.
Thanks, Tom. Our guest tonight doesn't need much of an introduction, but I'll provide one anyway. Jake Sullivan and I share at least one thing in common besides our Portsmouth links in different ways. We were both born a couple hours up the road at the UVM Medical Center in Burlington, Vermont, and both spent our first 6 months of our lives in Vermont, about 5 years apart or so. Jake, as probably everyone here sitting here and watching knows, has held a variety of posts in the U.S. government. After graduating from Yale, summa cum laude, and serving as a Rhodes Scholar, he then picked up a JD at Yale and made his way into public service, serving in the Obama administration and then serving as Joe Biden's national security advisor. He's now wearing 2 hats as a professor and a podcaster at the Harvard Kennedy School. And with that being said, I think we're honored to have him here at the Athenaeum for the first time. So please join me in giving Jake a warm welcome. So we're going to jump right in. We have about an hour to cover a tremendous amount of stuff that's happened in the past year, and America's role in the world. Never mind everything you dealt with in your time in office. So let me start close to home. The clear priority of the Trump administration is what they call hemispheric defense, or maybe it's been dubbed the Don Road Doctrine. You may see that as well. The recently released National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy both work out inside out. Start in the hemisphere, make the priority America's relations and its security with regard to its neighbors, especially to the south of us. We've seen the abduction, the capture of Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela. The administration is now talking about potentially a move in Cuba. Is made threats of strikes on the territory of our closest security partner in the hemisphere, Colombia, and our largest trading partner in the world, Mexico. So, if you could tell us your view of this increasingly securitized or militarized, really, approach to the hemisphere, and what you think they're getting right, if anything, and what they're getting wrong with this dramatically different approach to our own hemisphere.
First of all, it's great to be back here in Portsmouth and have the opportunity to come to the Athenaeum. And I want to start by just saying thank you for your service and what you did to put your life on the line for the country. And I think we should all. So they have self-styled it. Of course, President Trump himself has called it the Monroe Doctrine. Now, the original Monroe Doctrine that President James Monroe promulgated in the early 19th century was really a statement that said no more colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. We're not going to let outside colonial powers come here and continue to dominate the states in the region. The Donald Trump version of the Monroe Doctrine is the United States gets to dominate all the states of the region. And in Venezuela, to act in a way that is basically textbook colonial. We dictate terms to effectively a dictatorship. Maduro is gone, but the regime is still there, still repressing its people. And we dictate terms chiefly for the purpose of resource extraction, namely that we send in our oil companies and they bring oil out of the ground to the benefit, supposedly, of the United States. Now, to say that Venezuela has a lot of potential to be a big oil producer is sort of like saying I have a lot of potential to be a good hockey player. I do think I do have such potential, but it has never been realized very effectively. In fact, when I was a kid growing up in Minnesota after being born at the UVM Health Center and moving to Minnesota, a coach of mine, when I complained about not getting enough playing time, said, well, Jake, I could put you in, but it depends on whether you want to win or you want to play. And so that's my hockey potential. Right now, Venezuela pumps about 1 million barrels of oil a day. And it used to pump upwards of 3.5, close to 4. But because of just the absolute degradation of the infrastructure there, they just ran it into the ground. The idea that that is the place we're going to end up getting a lot more oil compared to many other places just doesn't make a huge amount of sense. And it feels like this has a lot more to do with basically a president who has decided on a certain kind of project, selected a group of executives and said, I want you to go get this stuff. So when you actually ask the real question, how does this benefit the people of the United States of America? I think it's hard to come to a positive answer, despite the fact that the military operation itself was quite remarkable. I mean, really, truly a high-risk operation by professionals who, you know, you've encountered over the years, putting themselves in harm's way and getting a bad guy out, but the net result of all of it, not all that positive. Then when you zoom out and you ask yourself, where does this go? I think the main two lessons that I take from the focus on the Monroe Doctrine are, one, Donald Trump has elevated migration and the idea of migrants as a threat to his paramount national security priority above all else. And this shows up not just in the part of the national security strategy that talks about the Western Hemisphere. There's a section of the national security strategy that talks about our traditional allies in Europe that is quite striking to read. I encourage all of you to read it. It basically says that Europe faces what it calls, quote, civilizational erasure because of migrants. And then it champions the idea of, quote, patriotic parties, namely far-right parties, taking over in Europe, essentially to expel immigrants. It says the biggest threat coming out of Europe is not Russia and Vladimir Putin, it's migrants. So migrants in the Western Hemisphere, migrants in Europe. And I think the streets of Minneapolis right now and what is happening there is not entirely disconnected from this national security strategy, because it's these folks are the threat, the enemy within, they must be expelled, etc. So we have to see all of these things as connecting to one another. The second big lesson to take from this is I think President Trump has decided that the use of American military power is kind of a thing he enjoys doing. And he thinks each time he does it, oh, it doesn't go so bad. Takes out Soleimani, 12-day war with Iran, operation to get Maduro. And I think, as we'll come to later, we are now on the cusp of a very high likelihood that we will engage again in new military action against Iran in the coming days or weeks. And I think his appetite for military action has grown with the eating. So looking at this Western Hemisphere thesis, you have to see how it connects to his overall view on migrants and the other as the enemy, and how it relates to his view about the use of American military power. And so for me, it has much broader implications. The final thing I will say is that I do believe that an elevated emphasis on our neighborhood, on Canada and Mexico, on the broader Western Hemisphere as a source of clean energy, resilient supply chains, dynamic growth, democracy. Actually, if I had, I confess that I think both the Biden and the Obama administrations did not put enough emphasis on our hemisphere. But there are better and worse ways to put a lot of emphasis on our hemisphere. So I think the nub of that instinct is correct. The application of it I find pretty problematic.
Thank you. Since you went there, let's talk about Iran. It certainly feels like strikes may be imminent. You know, there've been more and more naval and air assets moving to the region. I think it was just today, one of the open source reporters online showed there were a half dozen Growler, Hornet Growler, like electronic attack EW aircraft flying out of Pease, headed towards Europe and probably from there on to the Middle East with tankers, and those are kind of a preparatory thing for any attack. As you said, Jake, the president seems to have kind of developed this habit from his first term into his second of enjoying and thinking he has kind of carte blanche to use the military in limited, discrete ways, and thus far he's been lucky. You know, the strike, lucky or good, I guess is the question, right? The strike on Soleimani didn't precipitate a war with Iran. You know, precipitated a short kind of symbolic exchange. The strikes on Iran this past summer, which were unprecedented really for the United States, or you have to go back to the 80s, ended when we wanted them to effectively. So he's got that, and the Maduro operation, as you said, was a tactical success. So he's been able to get away with that against kind of lesser or middle powers. But as you alluded to, I think the appetite grows with the eating, and I don't know. There was almost a mantra among Marine gunnery sergeants when I was in. It was play stupid games, win stupid prizes, and so I wonder what you think. Going back to the well, potentially striking Iran again. What are the risks in doing that?
I think it's courting considerable risk. So before getting to the risks, it's important to ask, what is the purpose? What are we going to get out of it? And President Trump started painting himself into this corner when he basically said that if Iran kills protesters, the United States would strike Iran. And then went on to say, basically, to the protesters, get out there, go out. Help is on the way, was the formula that he used. So protesters did go to the streets and were gunned down in huge numbers, shocking numbers. More significant loss of life by a brutal regime crackdown against these protesters than at any point in the history of the Islamic Republic going back to 1979. A very significant, very brutal exercise of power, because the regime realized really early on they had to do whatever was necessary from their perspective to try and squash this. And the result of that is, in fact, that the protests for the moment have died down. So now President Trump has set the theater in military parlance. He's moved the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group in. He's moved fighter air wings. He's moved all of the tankers and the electronic warfare capability. And critically, he's moved in a bunch of air defense on the theory that Iran may try to fire back at us and we need to be able to protect our forces. So everything is set up for a military strike. One possibility is that it is a more symbolic strike, just to say, I want to impose some costs because of what you did. I want to follow through on saying I would strike you if you killed protesters. But then very little would change for those protesters or for life on the ground in Iran, and the regime would continue to squeeze and hold firm domestically. Another possibility is that they actually go for regime change, that they try to take out the senior leadership of the regime, that they have a sustained campaign that seeks to bring people back out into the street to topple it. And the history of the United States trying to bring about regime change by military action is not a pretty history. It is a highly risky history. And those risks include Iran responding by firing at American military personnel and killing Americans, and that is a genuine risk that CENTCOM is thinking through very hard right now. And it is also possible, as a wise commentator pointed out once, there are some countries that if the regime collapses, everything collapses inward, and there are some countries where if the regime collapses, everything explodes outward, and Iran is likely the latter case. This is a country that has an Arab population, an Azeri population, a Kurdish population, a Baloch population, and it is bordered by a range of states that are not exactly the most stable states in the world. And so the possibility that you get a massive power vacuum in the Middle East with really uncertain long-term effects is something that has to be taken into account. Marco Rubio, in a moment of kind of remarkable candor in the Congress yesterday, basically said, if there were regime change, we have no idea what would happen. And he said that quite publicly, and I thought, okay, that's good. But ... we may just go for it anyway, seems to be at least part of the thinking of the administration. So we'll have to see. The last point that I would make, I was part of the team that opened the secret channel with Iran that laid the pathway for the Iran nuclear deal. And I met with Iranian officials. This is the first high-level meeting with Iranian officials in decades. This is back in 2012. And I met with them over the course of 3 years as we built out our team that ultimately negotiated the deal with under the leadership of Secretary Kerry. Make no mistake, this regime is a regime of hard men who treat their people like, whatever the swear word is that you want to fill in there, terribly. And I can think of no better analogy or metaphor for this regime than the fact that the capital city, Tehran, is literally sinking into the ground. They have pumped out so much groundwater that it is sinking 10 inches per year in subsidence. And so through venality, corruption, mismanagement, the capital of this country is literally sinking into the ground. And if that doesn't tell you something about this regime, nothing will. So I think we have to be clear-eyed about that. But then we have to be equally clear-eyed in saying, does it make sense for the United States of America to decide to launch a major military campaign in light of that? I believe the answer to that question is no. We should find other ways to support the protesters, but trying to effectuate regime change through war makes no sense to me.
Yeah, let me follow up with one extra piece on that. You mentioned, working on the Iran nuclear deal. One thing that's been striking, I think, is that our longtime partners or client states in the region, the GCC countries, generally were very hawkish about Iran about a decade ago. Were in some cases urging us to strike Iran in a variety of ways, may have even pushed for regime change or considered that. Now, I think as a result of a lot of factors, they've kind of made some of their internal détentes and have warmed, smoothed over relations with Iran. And also, I think, view Israel very differently in the wake of the Gaza war, in the wake of the strike in Doha, than they did a few years before. I'm struck by the fact those countries are now really restraining elements on U.S. behavior in a way they were essentially the opposite a decade ago.
Yeah, so the reports suggest that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the Emir of Qatar, other leaders in the region actually picked up the phone and called Donald Trump and say, don't attack. Don't attack. And that is chiefly because these countries are looking at a situation where, from their perspective, their primary preoccupation now is what happens over the long term in a post-oil future, and what is their source of growth and ability to deliver for their people. And their answer is basically attract investment, build technology, develop clean energy, and the necessary condition for all of those things is peace or stability. And so the UAE, Saudi, Kuwait, Qatar, these countries have put now a new premium on trying to de-escalate rather than escalate these situations. And that is a huge change from when they were railing against the Iran nuclear deal and saying, in the immortal words of a previous king of Saudi Arabia, go cut off the head of the snake. But that is a change driven by a national ambition in these countries to try to achieve something because they see their future at some risk as we are going through this long-term energy transition, and they want to secure a future that works. And for that, they can't just rely on the kind of petrostate logic of decades past.
And so our theme tonight was America alone. So we'll pull a couple thousand miles west and I think talk first about Europe. This rupture with Europe It began kind of earlier in this administration. Ukraine was a piece of that to a degree, but I think the Greenland development, ambitions, whatever you want to call that, seems really salient. The fact that we had NATO countries going to conduct an exercise and put in effectively a tripwire force against the United States is certainly unprecedented. And I wonder, and obviously Mark Carney's speech in Davos got a lot of attention and sort of made it, even though I think he mentioned the United States once or twice, it was crystal clear who he was talking about and what he was talking about. And the recent Canadian-China deal on EVs is putting a little bit of teeth into that rhetoric. So, and I think you can go past Europe. You can look around, as I said, you look up to Canada, you look down to Mexico. The Undersecretary of Defense for Policy was just in South Korea and spoke about South Korea as a model ally, and I think it really is. It's also a load-bearing pillar of rearmament in Europe, as you know, in terms of their defense industry. But South Korea, a few months ago, we were locking up dozens of top executives of Hyundai because they happen to be, subject to an ICE raid. So all of this, I think, has induced tremendous amount of uncertainty and fear in some of our oldest and most important partners. And I'm struck by, if you go back better part of 20 years, maybe somewhat similar when George W. Bush left office and President Obama came in, there was a tremendous sense of relief, and he was immediately kind of feted and kind of given a Nobel Peace Prize, I think, because there was such a sense of relief after what the Bush administration did in 8 years. Maybe with that as a point of comparison, how, if nothing else salient happens, and that's probably a poor bet, but if the next 3 years we don't see a U.S. annexation, or if we don't take Greenland in some kind of deal at the point of a sword effectively, if we don't encourage secession in Alberta or any number of other things, if relations are roughly where they are now, how recoverable do you think this is, especially with regard to Europe and NATO?
This is the question to me. The United States' greatest asset is that we have a group of strong, capable democratic allies around the world, and we have just decided to give it away. And, I had a friend who recently returned from Beijing, where he met with a lot of senior leaders, and one of these leaders, in a surprisingly honest moment, said to him, we had a 10-year plan to drive a wedge between America and its allies because that's part of our strategic design over the long term, and you guys have just accomplished it for us in 1 year, so thank you very much. They are sitting in Beijing and they can't believe their luck, either in Europe or in Asia. And you see the Canadians flying to China, calling a new world order, taking common tariffs on electric vehicles so that China can't dump these vehicles on us and destroy our auto industry that we built in the Biden administration with Canada. The Canadians went and basically traded that away. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, is, as we speak, in China saying it's time for us to turn the page and take a different approach. And I think Macron at Davos said basically, from Europe's perspective, we're going to basically have to hedge between the United States and China going forward. Now, when President Biden was elected, he went to the G7 meeting in Cornwall in the summer of 2021 and said, America's back. And one of the leaders who was there said to him, yeah, but for how long? And then, of course, Trump was reelected. And I think Trump's reelection has created a circumstance in which there is no going back just to how things were before. It will not snap back. The challenge for all of us, and this is people in government and not in government, for everyone in this room, is to think, how do we sustain deep connections, friendships, alliances with like-minded communities and peoples around the world in light of what is going to be a period in American foreign policy of deep unpredictability and wild swings? Because you ask if it's recoverable. In some sense, it has to be recoverable because we occupy the same planet. We have to work together on big challenges. So we're going to have to find a way forward. But the formula for that will necessarily look different than the past many decades. And that's a shame. Because while we move into this new era, and while American foreign policy has had its ups and downs over the decades, the period from 1945 to today is the longest period of great power peace going back millennia. It is it's not often you get 80 years where great powers don't fight one another. And we've had that. And we are putting all of that at risk, in my view, by deciding to just tip over the entire table. And I think it will require people of goodwill, of all ideological stripes, to figure out a way forward. But we're going to have to recognize that that way forward will be fundamentally different, because our allies in Europe and in Asia and just right here in our own neighborhood, up the road in Canada and down in Mexico, are saying it's got to be a different kind of deal, because we just can't count on your constancy and your reliability over time. And they're not wrong to say that. So that's I think, the reality that we're facing in the period ahead.
Yeah, that leads me maybe pretty naturally to ask about what I think it was probably considered, and maybe you would agree, your kind of signature policy in your time in office was industrial policy, or one of the things you drove hardest on. It was one of the major achievements of the Biden administration. I think if it's your phrase or someone else's, but kind of small yard, high fence, putting up barriers to key kind of strategic industries and semiconductors, that supply chain, and keeping the really high-end chips out of China's hands in order to constrain AI and kind of broader technological advances, especially those with military applications, while still not escalating to the point of an open trade war and all, taking the gloves off completely. And then here at home, through the CHIPS Act and through other methods and other legislation, trying to both reshore and friendshore and kind of ensure resilience in supply chain, and also move the U.S. into some of what we think are going to be the key technologies of the century in front of us. Green energy being paramount, EVs, autonomous systems, all these kinds of things. But you've just kind of spoken to half of the equation. How realistic or how achievable is that for the United States, given the political swings and broader political dysfunction that it's now been going on for a while? I mean, this didn't happen overnight, and I would say it goes back to at least the 90s, if not earlier, that politics becomes more partisan, more of a blood sport, and more adversarial. So, one, there's that political dynamic, but I get the other piece is sort of economic and maybe structural, and that's the difficulty we seem to have mobilizing capital or doing anything faster at scale, right? And I guess I wondered the extent to which, as someone who spent 4 years in office and now is I'm sure working and considering these same issues out of office, to what extent is that structural? To what extent is our system of shareholder capitalism, of a fairly quarterly driven, fairly short-term kind of Wall Street heavily financialized economy, to what extent is that a major constraint, if not a hard break on a meaningful industrial policy?
So when we came into office in 2021, at that point, do you know what percentage of the highest end semiconductors that were going to power the coming AI revolution were produced in Taiwan? Anyone know? At that point, for the very highest end, the headline numbers were 92 and 8% by Samsung, but really by the time we came in, it was 100%. 100%. Produced on an island, 100-odd miles off the coast of China, with an uncertain political identity and legal status that China claims, that could be subject to a military action or invasion at any moment. And that's where it's all made, all of it. How crazy is it that the technology that powers basically the substrate of all technological advancement for the coming decades is on this island in this place at this time? That is nuts that we let that happen. And we let that happen over the course of decades. The United States used to produce 40% of all the world's semiconductors and a large share of the most advanced, and we offshored all of it. Just the production, because the United States does all the design. NVIDIA designs the chips, but when we walked into office, the only place that could actually make that chip was in Taiwan. So we began a very aggressive effort to try to build out the capacity to fabricate semiconductors in the United States, including getting TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Company, to open manufacturing facilities in Phoenix, Arizona. That first fab is up and running, so we now produce a small percentage of these most advanced chips. 5 more are on the way in this very large complex outside of Phoenix. But it's not enough, and it's too slow. And I do think a big part of it is that when you look at these industries that are so strategic, so fundamental, and then you look at how investors think, they're thinking, how am I getting the outsized returns on that? Right. So the design of the incentives in our financial system are not aligned with being able to build at speed and at scale for the technologies of the future. That goes for chips. It also goes for batteries. China basically dominates battery technology. There's no reason that should be the case, but they do because, again, we offshored it all. And batteries aren't important just for EVs. That electric stack is basically important to future of warfighting, to robotics, to drone technology, to every kind of autonomous system under the sun, as well as to the future of the auto industry. And we're more or less reliant on either Chinese technology or in some cases Korean or Japanese technology. And we started the process of trying to reshore that as well, to build out the capacity for us to have the means of production of this fundamental building block of the economy of the future. And here too, I would say our biggest challenge was time, being able to do this fast.
There's also a political aspect to that in terms of
on the
deliverables as well.
And on the battery side, when anything that smacks of clean energy, becomes a bit. The CHIPS was actually bipartisan. The Inflation Reduction Act, of course, was not. But a few months ago, I was sitting at a Dunkin' Donuts in Manchester in the parking lot, and I got a call from Ezra Klein, who was writing a column about the obstacles to being able to build fast and at scale and deliver. And I unburdened myself to him at some length. I wasn't sure if I was talking on the record or not on the record or just talking. So I was just talking. And then I see the column come out a couple days later, and it's me just holding forth about, the power of, to get anything done, you need 25 people to say yes. And if one person says no, it doesn't go anywhere. And, these cycles of delivery on these major public investments are over decades, and the political cycle is over 4 years, and that mismatch is really problematic. So I think we have a problem here, and I think that we need, not just on a bipartisan basis to come together, but to your point, we need the leaders of tech and finance and industry to come together and say the United States is capable of doing big things, and we're going to do them. And then the last point I would make is the Ukraine war drove home the fact that our defense industrial base has been completely hollowed out over the years, consolidated into a few major defense primes, so that we produced in 1 year the amount of artillery ammunition that Ukraine needed in 1 week. And then to say, okay, well, let's scale that up. Ukraine needs it. Let's go. So that'll be 2 or 3 years or more. Untenable. So we made a dent in this, but not enough. I think the Trump administration is trying some things, but unfortunately is choosing a strategy, in my view, that is much more about kind of picking friendly companies and saying, we'll do a deal with you and we'll take some cut of it. So it's not systematic, it's not at scale, and it's not inclusive. It's not bringing everyone in to say this has got to be a big national ambitious project. But I think it's central not just to our national security, but to America remaining at the cutting edge, because a country that loses the capacity to build will ultimately lose the capacity to innovate, because so much of innovation is about the trial and error of building. So in my view, among the major challenges facing our country in the next 25 years, this is a very significant one.
Can that even be done, do you think? I mean, you talk about bringing in business leaders and pushing them. Can that be done without coercion from the government? I mean, the way our economy is now structured, especially the way, as I said, how financialized it is, and how much everything in everybody's retirement is resting on the equity market in a way it wasn't a generation ago. Is that doable without major economic restructuring?
I think it's doable with the government actually putting skin in the game. And this is where industrial strategy comes in. And industrial strategy can fail. So you have to be disciplined. You have to do it right. You have to keep it, insulated from politics. All very difficult things to do in the current political environment. But the CHIPS Act worked. I mean, it did stimulate substantial investment in an industry that had been hollowed out, and that was largely through a grant and tax credit incentive structure that essentially made the economics work. And I think for relatively affordable amounts of money, the U.S. government can make the economics work. I think there is some degree to which we should say we're insisting this happen, i.e. our Defense Department is only going to buy from a supply chain that is resilient and diversified. And that demand signal, that mandate of sorts, will drive investment as well. So there are multiple tools, I think, that you can bring to bear here. It is totally doable. It's completely within our capacity to do. Mm-hmm. The question is whether we'll summon the will to do it. And I have a lot of hard-earned lessons on both what we got right and where we fell short. But I think there is a project that can be pursued here in a real way over time.
Jake, if you'll forgive me for being candid for a moment, I think the Biden administration ultimately failed. And by that I mean, as we've said now for a minute, a lot was accomplished, sometimes with razor-thin majorities in Congress and in the Senate. But we're sitting here and Donald Trump is back in office. And for all the good that was accomplished in a lot of different discrete areas, or even kind of holistically, the CHIPS Act is outpaced by how much is being spent on ICE detention centers now. So with that as backdrop, if you could go back, knowing what you know now, what's one thing you would have done differently in your time in office?
It's a great question. So I'll start by saying that I think the three driving factors in the election, from my perspective, were one, cost of living, which is still driving attitudes towards public figures today. And that really was a COVID shock that then we had to manage and deal with. And you could look back and say, were there other ways to try to get at that earlier on? The second was the border. And there were robust debates within the administration about how to deal with the border. And then the third was this set of sort of cultural issues that ended up kind of boomeranging against Democrats in significant ways. I think that in the national security space, the issue politically, if all we were thinking was just make sure that we don't see a return of President Trump. So it's just, and we didn't think about that in the national security space. But if that's kind of the metric, and I think in a way it's a fair metric, then the most harmful political outcome, if I'm just being candid, was the fallout from the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which took a real toll on the president. And he knew going in he was taking a risk. And he had conviction that this was the right thing to do and that America in 2025, 2026 is better off that we are not still sending generations of young men and women to fight and die in Afghanistan. But if he had just made, if that decision hadn't been taken through the lens of just kind of what's the right policy, but what's the risk on the politics, that's a question that he could potentially have to revisit. So on the metric of we're sitting here today and we didn't pass the baton to Vice President Harris, we passed it to the return of Donald Trump. That's something I look back on and think a lot about.
If I can unpack that a little, and then I'll open it up to everyone here. Do you view Afghanistan then as primarily a policy failure, an execution failure, or a messaging failure? And I would say, just for what it's worth, as someone that spent a little bit of time over there, I actually thought that was one of the best things, President Biden and the administration did in office. I think that for all of the dysfunction of how it was executed and at the risk of being glib, I mean, you don't lose a war over 20 years and then walk out in a nice fashion 9 times out of 10. In fact, I think we got really lucky with how quickly the country fell in some ways, paradoxically. But that certainly wasn't the view. What got shown on screens around the world was people falling off planes and the chaos of the evacuation and the Afghan security state and military vanishing overnight, which they had done, of course, when we came in the first place. The Taliban's allies deserted them. As you kind of alluded to, the second order effects of that, I mean, God forbid if we had troops in Afghanistan still when the Ukraine war kicked off, Exactly. They would have been targets for the Russians. They would have done to us what we did to them on a smaller scale. So I'm thankful that was executed and that essentially in a funny way, the Biden administration carried the baton from President Trump's, Doha deal and desire to get out and all of that messy bag you guys were handed as far as that piece of the pie. But how do you view those, again, whether it's the policy you inherited, whether it's the execution of the withdrawal, or whether it's how that was messaged and how that was put out to the world?
I think the policy was correct, and I think America's better off to not still be in Afghanistan today. And I agree with you that you cannot end a war after 20 years with all of everything that's piled up over those 20 years and have it be done without real challenge. It's just not plausible. And also what our folks did to get 124,000 people out of that country, to get every American who wanted to leave out of that country, and to continue bringing people out all the way up to the end of the Biden administration was quite remarkable. And also, even in the aftermath, to be able to go get the number one guy in Al-Qaeda from the air without troops on the ground kind of showed that there is a way to continue to manage this issue on a going forward basis. Of course, the way in which the evacuation unfolded, there are moments where I look back and say, if we had moved, just operationally, if we had moved here or sooner or there sooner or so forth,
Bagram debate or whatever.
Things like that, for sure. But your question was really about how did we end up where we are today? And I think because of the way that the end of that war came through the television screens or the phone screens for people, it had a big impact. Yeah. And that's just a reality. And it's interesting. I mean, as a national security advisor at the time, the furthest thing from my mind was what are the electoral implications for whatever. But you're asking a reasonable question, which is how do you think about the knock-on effects of choices you make, even if the net policy is right, if they end up having some of these collateral consequences?
Yeah. And not that you can just shove it off on that, but communication-wise, it kind of immediately brought to mind Saigon, even if the majority of Americans weren't alive for that. Those images map onto each other, and I don't know what the answer is. I'm not saying you could message your way out of a bad situation, but that strikes me as pretty salient.
I went to the White House podium the day after the incident of the plane that took off and the tragedy of the guy falling from the plane. I stood there for an hour taking questions. That was trial by fire, for sure. Getting up there and trying to say, this is terrible, but to also try to have the conviction to say, the president made a decision. We're not staying here forever. We are leaving and we've got to go. How to message in the face of all of that and the power of images and what they can do to shape a storyline and the psyche of the American people as they react to it. That's something that you can't really fully understand until you're living in the middle of it.
With that being said, let's open it up to the audience. I'm going to repeat people's questions just for the video and everyone at home, although speaking up is helpful too. Sir?
Yeah, just a comment and a question. I'm old enough to remember the end of the Vietnam War, which was not much different when you look at the visuals of what happened in Vietnam with the helicopters taking off from the embassy in Saigon and all that. And it probably affected Ford's re-election in 75 and then 76. But it didn't have the same visceral effect, I don't think, nationally, because we had Watergate and all that stuff combined with it, as what happened in Afghanistan, which was a disaster because we turned an anti-terrorism event into a nation-building event, which we never should have done in the first place. But my question is, you mentioned innovation. And innovation is one of the hallmark things that America's done great for the last 100 years or longer. How is this policy on our immigration policy and how we're treating not only the brown people from this hemisphere, but people from around the globe not wanting to come here anymore, right. Us leaving losing brain trust in the future, and how is that going to affect our innovation going forward for the long term?
If I can the question was about innovation and about how U.S. immigration policy, the punitive immigration policy, is going to both prevent talent from coming in here and fostering innovation in the U.S. and also drive out a lot of talent and lead to brain drain.
So the founding prime minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, who is kind of a Yoda-like figure, lots of aphorisms and so forth, was once asked, ultimately, isn't China just 4 times bigger than the United States? So it's just going to be 4 times more powerful and innovative in the future. And he said, well, not really, because China has 1 billion people, it's true, and they can access the talent of 1 billion people, but the United States of America can access the talent of 8 billion people. And that's a special thing about America. And if you look at, just as one example, this arms race to hire the top talent by the AI labs, where they're willing to pay $100 million to get, this particular AI scientist. And Mark Zuckerberg had this list of 15 people. I think 14 out of the 15 of them were immigrants. Yeah. Okay. So, and you look at innovative startups in basically every industry, the number of them founded by immigrants to this country is both remarkable and inspiring. And it's so American. And yeah, what we are doing is basically putting out a giant sign that says, don't come here because you are not welcome and you are not safe. And that it has catastrophic implications for who we are as a country, just fundamentally, not just in terms of our decency, but in terms of our identity as innovators, entrepreneurs, and the pioneers of the future. Because propelling all of that is immigrants. And then when you put on top of that, what's the kind of secret formula of the United States for innovation beyond our ability to attract the best minds from around the world? It's essentially a tripod. Basic research funding from the government, the best university system in the world, and then a private sector that can draw upon those two. And we've kicked 2 legs of that tripod just right out. We've declared war on universities, and we've slashed basic research funding. So we can have our, arguments about Venezuela, Iran. These are big and real things. But something else is happening here that's so much more foundational, that goes to the heart of our competitive edge over time. And I felt one of the things that I cared a lot about as National Security Advisor was the role of technology and national security in this moment of an AI revolution, a biotech revolution, a quantum revolution, all happening at once, transforming our economy, our society, our security. So these foundational elements strike at the heart of America's competitive edge, and it's very disturbing. And the conviction that the people around the president and the president himself seem to have to keep doubling and tripling down on this does not leave me very hopeful about what's to come in the next 3 years.
Yeah, I had a question about China. I seem to remember that when you were in office, you described the main drivers of China policy then as, let's see if I remember, it was de-risk, diversify without decoupling.
Right.
All D's, I think that's how I remember. My question is then, has that changed in the last year, and if so, how?
The question was about China policy, about de-risking, decoupling, or de-risking and diversifying without decoupling, and whether those are still the drivers of China policy.
That's right. It was, so our strategy was to de-risk, not decouple. And de-risk basically meant do not be in a position where you rely upon China for strategic goods that they could just cut off. I'll come to that in a second. And it also meant being able to build up a set of allies and partners together in a de-risking strategy that ensured that Chinese coercion or aggression could not fundamentally adversely affect your national security. But not decouple, meaning we're not going to stop trading with China. We're not going to end our economic relationship with them. Over the course of the 4 years, we actually aligned Europe, Japan, India, Korea, Australia, Canada around this de-risking strategy. Today, I think the single biggest change has actually been that the rest of those countries are now talking about de-risking the United States. also de-risking China, but de-risking the U.S. So a hedging strategy against both of them, which I think is not great for us. In the direct bilateral relationship, I think the biggest change is that President Trump has basically concluded that he respects Xi Jinping. He wants a good relationship with China. He wants to focus on our hemisphere. And he's kind of implying a sort of spheres of influence world in which China runs affairs in its area and we run affairs in our area, and otherwise we'll just work things out between us just fine. And that's what I think this year is going to be all about. So President Trump is going to Beijing in a couple months, and then Xi Jinping is coming to Washington later this year for a state visit. And this all seems to be setting up for a series of agreements that are essentially out of the playbook of great powers from centuries past. Basically, you're a big country, we're a big country, we'll each deal with the small countries around us, we'll kind of stay out of each other's way, and as the National Defense Strategy put it, we'll have a decent peace. Now, some part of this, the idea that we don't want to go to war with China or end up in a downward spiral with China, I agree with that. But casting aside an alliance system and a set of rules and norms that I think have worked not just for the U.S., but frankly for China over the last many decades, I think is inviting in this kind of law of the jungle world that I think will be more dangerous for the United States and increases, not decreases, risk of a potential war over Taiwan.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up on that, Jake. You said at the end there when you came to Taiwan, I mean, that's what's potentially on the menu, right? Is some, and maybe it doesn't happen 3 years from now, we're in basically the same situation, or maybe it does, but a scenario where Taiwan is returned de facto, not just de jure, to China. How do you think, if that were to happen, let's say without violence, and China assumes full control of Taiwan, how do you think our major, and I'm thinking those three major partners in the Pacific, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, react to that? Do you think they view that as they're going to balance against Chinese ambitions even more and cling tighter to the United States? Or do you think they would, at that point, view the U.S. as a wholly unreliable security provider in the Pacific?
I think the latter. And we're already seeing that to a certain extent. The Japanese Prime Minister, Takaichi, first female Japanese Prime Minister, her role model is Margaret Thatcher. So she wears blue and pearls almost every day. Honestly, she does. And she's known as the Japanese Iron Lady. Very tough, very hawkish. A couple months ago was giving testimony in the Diet, the Japanese parliament, and made a comment about basically how a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be existential for Japan. This was a departure from the polite language that Japanese prime ministers had used before, and Beijing went ballistic. So ballistic, in fact, that the consul general in Okinawa, the Chinese consul general in the Japanese city of Okinawa, put out a tweet that says we must cut off the neck of the Japanese prime minister. Put out a tweet. Ultimately pulled the tweet down, but is still in his job. Okay, this is, and they went on an absolutely relentless barrage. They turned the cruise ships around, so cut off Chinese tourists to Japan. They took a series of other economically coercive measures. And basically, President Trump, rather than calling Takaichi, called Xi Jinping, who told him, you need to tell Takaichi to get in line. And then Trump called Takaichi and more or less said that. The result from the Japanese perspective is that they have doubts today, even before a contingency like that, about whether they're going to have to accommodate to Japan because the U.S. is not going to stand behind them. And that, I think, is part of a larger unraveling of trust and confidence in the Indo-Pacific that will continue to play out over time if there's not a change of course.
I'm a former U.S. diplomat. I was a political advisor at the U.S. Mission to the United Nations 20 years ago. And the people I worked with were the top diplomats in the State Department. And at this stage of their careers, 20 years later, they were all becoming ambassadors or eligible to become ambassadors. They're all gone. They've all left the Foreign Service. how, this is the question that keeps me up at night. How do we rebuild in this very fragile system? Because Donald Trump's not going to be around forever. How do we rebuild when we've lost all the talent of those 20 years, 25 plus years of training, and they're not coming back?
The question from a former political advisor in the U.S. mission to the United Nations was about the hemorrhaging of talent, especially diplomatic talent, and all of 20 plus year veterans who should be assuming ambassadorships now and have left the foreign service, left government service, and how to get that talent back, after this administration. And I would just add too, how to get talent in, because a lot of people are now tremendously disincentivized after seeing whether it's government shutdowns, even that has an impact. Whether it's seeing mass layoffs in the foreign service and USAID, whether people in the intelligence community, I'm sure you know folks that have been asked to do things they don't think are ethically or the right thing to do and leave. There are untold numbers of people that have headed for the exits or aren't coming in.
Yeah, this is the companion to the conversation we were having earlier about how do you deal with allies and friends in the future in the face of unpredictability. It's how do you look people in the eye and say, no, serve, come back. When they say, well, 4 years from now I might, not just get fired, but be declared an enemy, a traitor, a leech. I mean, the way in which our public servants were treated in this Doge era, I thought was shocking and shabby. And personally, for their service, and thank you for your service on behalf of the United States, these are people who wake up every day to serve the public trust, the public interest. I think my practical answer to this is that I think a future administration has to rethink the way of hiring entirely, so that we basically say to a lot of people who were forced out, you come back and we will put you back where you were, not you go to the back of the line or it's too late now, you've had to retire, that we actually create the flexibility to say, we want that talent, and we want it in the places it was meant to be before this was disrupted. And yeah, we can't count on this forever, but we're going to give people, empower people, career people with senior assignments, at a great scale right out of the gate. That's hard to do because in a transition, it's hard to staff up like that. But I think people should be working on that now because this is such a huge problem. I just read a story this morning that 10,000 STEM PhDs have left the U.S. government in the last year. 10,000 science and tech PhDs. Beyond the diplomatic talent, the development talent, the talent from many other departments and agencies. So that would be my answer. But I think this is a huge issue because personnel is policy. Your policy is only as good as having the people who can carry it out.
And back, sir, is our final question.
Jake, John Shaw, I run a specialty chemical company here that's based in London, so we have a lot of experience in Europe. We rely on all our raw materials come from Asia, so we rely on Asia on it, which actually was only made worse by tariffs that Obama put in. But if you look at the economic one, I mean, this is, as much as I dislike the current administration, these are all 30-year problems.
Yeah.
And the situation has been pretty evident of it, whether the economic decline of the U.S., the dollar side of it, immigration's been there. And it's been equal failures on both repeated presidents, repeated parties. So isn't it a failure both of the Republican and the Democratic parties over the last 30 years to where we are? I say to you, it's like, so what are the Democrats going to do other than just be, we're not Trump, which didn't work last time. What are the Democrats going to do to actually come back and address these fundamental issues that have been sitting there and actually create an executive power? Executive power has been used by multiple presidents for many years. We now have somebody using it at an extreme level, but even the executive power is a failure of the two parties. What are we going to do? You're a leader in the Democratic Party. What are you going to do to get the Democratic Party to help have effective parties so we can get out of this 30-year demise that we've been in?
The question was about the longer running nature of a lot of these problems we're grappling with, whether it's trade and offshoring of U.S. manufacturing, decline of the currency, immigration is a continuing ulcer, and what the Democratic Party can offer as a positive agenda to fix some of these problems that didn't happen overnight.
So I'll separate this into two categories. One is kind of the policy, and the other is the politics and the parties. And I will preview that my answer to the second is going to be I don't know. But I'm not trying to be glib. I will come back to that. It's a very hard problem you identify. On the policy front, I agree with you that, first, just as a baseline, if you look at the U.S. economy versus any of the other major industrialized economies over the last 30 years, as a matter of innovation, growth, median income, et cetera, the U.S. economy has done much better than Europe, Japan, go down the list. That's not to say we should just be the tallest midget in the circus. We want to do better. But I think we do have to start with some recognition that it hasn't been all bad news. The bad news has not been top-line growth or top-line capacity to continue to be at the cutting edge of innovation. It's been a story about two things. One, the hollowing out of certain aspects of our industrial base that are critical to our national capacity, and two, how to have shared prosperity, that all of that top-line growth actually everyone can share in. The first half of that, we did not do well enough because we didn't have enough time or, break through the barriers far enough. But the basic formula of industrial strategy that we put forward through the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act and other measures added manufacturing jobs at scale for the first time in any presidency in quite some time under President Biden. We are now losing manufacturing jobs, chiefly because of tariffs on intermediate goods in this administration. So I think the basic theory on a bipartisan basis of saying there are certain key industries we need to sustain in the United States and reshore to the United States is the correct story. And I think that can have a bipartisan basis to it and a bipartisan appeal to it. This is why I have a hard time on the politics, because I do think that there are some fundamentally straightforward things we can do when it comes to sharing prosperity in a way that lifts everybody up that are stuck on the politics. I'll just give you one great example. In the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a doubling of the child tax credit for 1 year. In that 1 year, child poverty was cut in half. Boom. And then it just went away, and child poverty went back up. And it's like, why? So, and that's political gridlock, right? That you just can't produce the vote. So what's going to be required to get more of a political consensus generated so that for a certain set of policy interventions we can get beyond the typical left-right debates and actually just do some things that are common sense? That's where I confess I don't have the answer. I think the answer has to lie in more of a bottom-up than top-down message coming from people saying that we are going to hold our leaders accountable for working across the aisle in a real way. And I don't know if that's, in today's current political environment, that's very plausible. And then we have a president who right now is pushing every signal in the opposite direction. Let's not work together. Let's work very far apart. And I think that's problematic in its own way. So on the policy front, I think there is a recipe that recognizes a long period of shortcoming across multiple administrations that we can push in the right direction. On the politics of it, though, I don't believe that I have anything more special to offer than anyone else in this room.
Well, on that mixed note, we're gonna close it off here. But Jake, thanks for a great conversation, and please thank Jake for joining us tonight.
I'm a retired military officer,
One moment.
and I'm really concerned about, what do you see the military
Reception downstairs, wine, and
Join us for a glass of wine. Rich,
following through with
glass of wine downstairs. Poor Jane.
orders and
Well done. You did a wonderful job.